Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nikki McFarlane-Holm, and I am an account executive here at Corporate Risk Solutions. If you're joining us today, you are here for the monthly educational webinar series that we put on. We have been speaking with folks just like yourselves all over the nation about the most pertinent and industry-specific categories, industry's hottest topics, if you will. And today we're going to talk about low-impact CIP requirements. A couple of just quick laundry items I'd like to mention. If you look over to the right-hand portion of your screen, there's a pane there that has a section called Handouts. Those handouts are PDFs that you can actually click on that will give you some instruction on how to submit questions. During this call, we will actually make sure that it's quiet so only the speaker can be heard, but we've got one of our subject matter experts, our IT staff consultant, Stephen Ostrov, on the line today listening, and he will be responding digitally to those questions that you're submitting. We will keep this at about 50 minutes or less to be mindful of your time, and we'll open it up for questions at the end. I personally will be reaching back out to you to provide you with some details, the white paper specifically, and the slide deck here within the next 24 to 48 hours. I'm looking forward to speaking to you then. For now, I'd like to go ahead and get our presenter introduced today. I would like to welcome Mr. Boyd Nation. He is one of our senior technical advisors. Boyd has been in this industry for nearly 2 decades. He has a bulk of knowledge, and he's excited to share with you today what he knows about low-impact CIP requirements.
Thank you, Nikki. And I believe that I failed to advance the slides properly there, but that's me. As Nikki said, I've been doing this for quite a long time, and will certainly be looking forward to answering any of your questions and addressing this and kind of walking you through the presentation today. This is Steve, who's standing by to answer questions in the background today and everything, so certainly you can get more information about that. And as Nikki said, this presentation is available for download through the course of this if you need to take a better look at these or any of the other slides. So with that, we'll kind of head on into the material. Here's our overall housekeeping material. We're going to be here for less than an hour today, or right at an hour if we go as long as possible. We've had our introduction, and the presentation is starting now, and we'll do a question and answer period at the end. So with that in mind, let's move on into where we're actually headed for the meat of the presentation today. This presentation is, to be honest, a call for action with enough solid technical material thrown in to make it worth your while to be here to hear the call for action. You need to get started. And that you is industry-wide. By and large, most of the entities out there are probably at a point where there needs to be a little bit more accelerated action, not in specifically addressing the low-impact requirements, but in making a plan for them, because there's a potential resource crunch or multiple potential resource crunches that are out there that you want to be mindful of and watch out for, and the best way to ensure that you don't fall into some pitfall where you're having to catch up rapidly towards the end of things is to go ahead and get a good solid plan in place now and identify where you're going to need to bring in additional resources and move forward from there. Once we do that, we'll walk through a quick summary of what the current requirements are and the timetable for them, go into a little bit more depth on each of the 4 sections that are currently approved as part of the standard, and then kind of look at what the future directions are that the drafting team is headed towards. So with all that in mind, and we'll wrap up at the end and turn it over to you for questions. So that's the very broad roadmap of what's going on. So why do you need to get started right now? What's my case for that? Well, first of all, everybody has SIP fatigue right now. You've worked as an organization, assuming that you have medium or high impact asset, cyber systems in place. You've been working for 6, 12, 18, 24, 30 months, hard as you possibly could, just to get to the deadline point that we're kind of at right now, where you were aiming to be compliant by April 1st, hopefully hit that, but if not, through the machinations of the process winding through, ended up giving you till July 1st. But either way, everybody is worn out by this right now, and really the last thing you want to think about is what's the next set of standards coming down the pipeline. That fatigue is perfectly understandable. It's also dangerous because it's not that you don't have time to get everything done. It's that you need to know how much time you need to have to get everything done. So that's why you need to get started. If you look at any single facility, we'll talk through this as we go on, but the low impact requirements are on the simple side right now. There's some things that you have to do. There's some things that are not trivial, but you get to define most of what's going to happen. You get to make the plan for it. And for any given facility, any given substation, any given power plant, there's not going to be anything that's all that hard to get done in the amount of time that you've got. Where it gets dangerous is that you probably have, relative to whatever size your organization is, you probably have what you would consider to be a lot of low impact facilities. As I just said, most of those are going to be either power plants or substations, transmission substations. There are some other categories in there. There is such a thing as a low impact control center, and some of you might have that. There are special protection systems and remedial action schemes and those sorts of things. Those are all out there, but for the most part, those aren't going to be a huge part of the overall burden. If you've got them, you probably don't have more than one or two of them, and they're not going to stress the overall resource thing. So we're going to focus today on the power plants and substations, and you probably have a lot of those. Now, if it takes you, let's just make up some numbers here. If it takes you 2 weeks to make a single facility compliant with whatever you decide that means, so whatever your physical security plan ends up being, whatever your engineering changes are needed to properly manage electronic access, all of those things. If it takes you 2 weeks for each site to do that, well, I guess 2 weeks in the next, frankly, 2.5 years at this point, you can pull this off. If you have, let's use a larger utility just to make the math interesting, but the scales, because the fewer resources, the fewer facilities you have, the fewer resources you have available, most likely. Let's say you're a relatively large entity and you have 200 substations to do this on. You multiply 200 times 2, and all of a sudden you've shot well past your end of, if you had a single team trying to do this, you shot well past your 2018 deadline already. Now, you probably, if you're that large, you probably have multiple teams that can work on these things, but how many teams do you need, and how long does it take, and is that 2 weeks accurate? And all of these things you need to kind of get a feel for, and that's why at this point you need to be making a plan. You need to be putting together a project plan, not down to the nuclear outage level of detail of every 30 seconds planned or whatever like that, but at least to the level of, okay, we're going to need this number of resources and we've only got this amount of time, and we better get started, or we better at least get the contracting wheels in motion so that we can bring in some external resources in 2017 when it looks like we'll need them. Any of those things. That's why you need to get started at this point on making the plan. All right, so what does that plan need to cover? Well, let's get started looking at what's actually in the standard over the course of the the 4 sections that are in there currently, and so on. And here's the very high level bullet list. You have to do something with cybersecurity awareness. We'll talk about the repercussions of that, but this is probably the lowest hanging fruit of the entire bunch. Basically, you have to present cybersecurity awareness materials at least once every subversion of annual, which is once every 15 months, and do so in a credible manner that leads you to believe that those with access to your facility, or whether physically or electronically, are going to be exposed to those materials. You have to include low-impact facilities in a cybersecurity incident response plan, whether that's your primary one or not. We'll talk about the implications of that as we go forward. You have to have a plan to physically control access to the cyber systems within that low-impact facility. And there are some requirements for how you configure external electronic access and the control for that. So, all of those are the 4 pieces. We'll get a little bit more detail about that as we go forward, but that's the general guideline as to where the standards are taking you. You'll notice that in all of those cases, not a lot of specificity as to how you do it, and we'll get into more detail on each of them, but really the closest thing to a specific requirement is the requirement that there be a low-impact external access point. But even there, there's not anything that's going to cause you to go in a very specific direction for the most part. So, all right, that in mind, let's look at some deadlines. The timetable for compliance deadlines, and the first one of these is one that is slipping up on some people, so you want to make sure you don't miss that. Yes, the drafting team and approved by FERC have set most of the deadlines for low impact when they moved to version 6 and added more detail well down the road. But there's one that didn't change. The compliance deadline for CIP 2 or 1.3 it's the same as it always has been, except for the 3-month extension that FERC granted for the overall version 5/6 standards. But we're still looking at July 1st, 2016, by which time you are required to have a list of assets containing low-impact best cyber systems signed by your CIP senior manager or delegate. Okay. It's make a list, which is not purely a paperwork exercise, but it's close to it, and then have it signed. The one nuance to this is kind of interesting. This is the case where you might end up over-complying depending upon the nature of your operations and the age of your facilities and that sort of thing. If you have a list of assets and most of those assets contain low-impact best cyber systems, but you have entries in that list that don't actually include low-impact best cyber systems or any best cyber systems, then by the letter of the law, it's conceivable that you're not entirely in compliance there. And so, our absolute most conservative consultant advice would be to verify that you actually have best cyber systems in each of these facilities and everything. I'll be honest that I've never seen in a case like this an auditor get overly fussy that there were excessive items on the list, as long as by the compliance deadline, everything had been straightened up and cleaned up. So, the worst case scenario here maybe is that you identify just a list of all your substations and generating stations and remove the ones that are medium impact, and have that signed. Ideally, you want to make sure that there is actually low impact best cyber systems in there. The cases where you don't have low impact best cyber systems are going to be relatively rare, but older substations, for example, where everything is electromechanical, could conceivably be there. There are possibly some configurations where you might not, you might have programmable elements within a substation, but none of them were capable of a 15-minute impact, something along those lines. So you can review those things quite thoroughly in the long run. In the short run, at least make sure you have a list and make sure that you have that signed off on. Okay, looking down the road then, the stuff that most people think of as actual low impact that need to be handled by April 1st of 2017. Okay. CIP 3R 1.2 requires you to have a policy covering the 4 aspects of low impact compliance. So the document pieces must all be done by April 1st of 2017. The policy is the first one of those. The second part of that is that CIP 3R2 requires you to have a plan for each of those 4 areas. Now that plan can, if it's simple enough, that plan can be embedded within the policy. If it's not, it'll be a separate plan document, all of those things. So one way or the other, those documents have to be completed and signed by April 1st, 2017. Now, not all of those plans have to be implemented by that time, which is where the 2018 date comes in, but all 4 of the plans must be completed. They can be revised as you go forward. If you discover things during implementation that are infeasible, that's perfectly acceptable. But there must be a plan in place, and it must be approved by April 1st, 2017. 2 of the plans must actually be implemented by April 1st, 2017. Those are the 2 easier ones, the ones that are almost entirely documentation efforts. The plan for cybersecurity awareness must be implemented by then, and then the plan for cybersecurity incident response must be implemented by April 1st, 2017. The other 2, the ones that are going to take more effort, are the plan for physical access control and the plan for electronic access control. And both of those must be completed by September 1st, 2018. So you have, from the time I'm speaking this, you have a little over 27 months to implement these 2 plans. And in general terms, that should be, as we said back at the beginning, plenty of time to do it at any one site, but the amount of time for any given site has to be multiplied by all of your low impact facilities, and that again is why you need to have a plan in place, a project plan in place for getting all of this carried out. Okay. All right, so what's in these actual 4 sections in a little bit more detail? Cybersecurity awareness. For the most part, if you have high or medium impact facilities, best cyber systems, you have created a cybersecurity awareness program, which is already in place, probably already carrying forward. If it's not, it has to start within the next few weeks. And this program is there. And in most cases, that program can be extended, possibly with some modifications to allow yourself a little more breathing room, since the requirements are easier for low impact, out, to cover the low impact facilities, and you're done with it. Okay, you get the low impact out there. You get the posters out into the facility. You get the broad spectrum communications out electronically and get them there. All of those things are extensible quite easily from the way that you probably did it for high or medium impact. One thing to watch out for, though, if you built your high and medium impact program in such a way that it only functions if you have specific contact information for all of the recipients, that's going to be a little bit harder to extend. That doesn't mean that it's impossible, but in a general sense, you may need to think of using a different method for low impact, or revising the program, something along those lines. And the reason for that is that it would be very rare for an entity to decide to maintain a list of all individuals with access to a low impact facility. You're not required to do so. There's nothing from CIP 4 applies here. Nothing across the board requires you to maintain that list. And those lists tend to be extensive and hard to manage. So the odds are pretty good that you're going to decide not to do that. That means, since you don't have a specific list of people, you don't have a specific list of, say, email addresses or mailing, physical mailing addresses or any of those things, but specifically email addresses are probably going to be the main thing. That means that if your cybersecurity awareness program is entirely dependent upon emailing materials to everyone on the list periodically, that's not going to work for low impact, and you're going to have to come up with a different way to do it. And as I said, intranet communications can work for this. Posters can work for this for personnel who have physical access. You're probably going to want, similarly to the way you do for medium impact, to have a patchwork of methods in place so that you make sure that on a periodic basis, once every 15 months, you cover everyone who has physical access only, and you cover everyone who has electronic access only. You also want to make sure that you cover the usual thorn in everyone's side, which is contractors and vendor personnel, many of whom may not ever come on site and also may not have access to your internal intranet. So it may be that you want to have an addendum to the program wherein you write into the contracts that a contract manager at the contracting company is responsible for disseminating materials internally, and you provide that to the contract manager on a periodic basis. That's one method of handling it. It's one that tends to work pretty well. There are other ways to do so, but just make sure that you find some method of doing that somewhere along the way. Okay, so that's kind of the broad picture for cybersecurity awareness, and I don't think this one's going to be one that causes too many people too much heartache. Okay. Cybersecurity incident response. At a high level, this is of similar complexity to cybersecurity awareness. There's one wrinkle we'll talk about, for most of the slide actually, but in general, the same personnel with some extensions to cover local support are going to be involved in incident response relative to your high and medium impact ones, facilities that are involved at low impact. So in other words, it's going to tend to be the same IT/security/ SCADA support, whatever you call them locally, personnel who are involved in investigating an incident if it involves a low impact facility as high and medium, with, as I said, some extensions out to include local support personnel, since depending upon how geographically distributed you are, you're probably going to want somebody to go and actually touch the metal at some point and have contacts available for that. So you're probably going to need to extend your maintained contact list quite a lot and get the facilities in place, the personnel in place to support all of this. But it will fit into the same framework and have the same response steps as your original plan does. Now, using that original plan kind of creates some wrinkles, though. Under the definition of best cyber system information, revised for version 5, that's in the NERC glossary, any incident response plan for high or medium impact has to be classified as, is best cyber system information, and has to fall under whatever your handling requirements are from CIP 11 R1.2 for that plan, for that level of confidentiality. So if you have a only two levels of classification, which is to say this is best cyber system information and gets labeled as confidential or something, or it's not, then, well, it is in this case. If you've made it so that there are extra requirements for getting into the repositories where these are stored, so for example, a lot of entities, even though it's not required by the standard, a lot of entities require that you have a background check, PRA, for example, to get access to that information. Regardless of whether it's required by the standard or not, that's just an internal safeguard that's there. Even if you don't do that, you still have to manage access to the designated storage locations where these are stored, and even that can be a logistical problem if you have dozens of personnel from plant sites or from substation support that need to have access to the plan. So this can be a kind of a management headache if you're trying to pull this together. There are several different ways to handle this. And then three of them are on the screen there. You can minimize the access requirements to make it as simple as possible for someone to get access to the storage location where this plan is stored, to kind of minimize the overhead there. So if you can consider, if you want to make this case, removing the requirement that a PRA be conducted before granting access to a designated storage location, for example. Not my favorite solution because it's reducing security just for compliance purposes, but it's something that can be done. You can create a multi-tiered classification system so that rather than confidential and not best cyber system information, you have a third or fourth or whatever category, which you label as something like internal, which means that yes, we know this is best cyber system information, but after doing the risk analysis, we feel like it's not appropriate to classify this in a way that it has to be stored only in a designated storage location. And you put restrictions on it instead, that if it's in this internal classification, which you can make a good solid case that it's a good thing to use for your incident response plan, then the restrictions are that you can't disseminate it outside the organization, and that maybe some restrictions, but none that require it to be permanently stored in a designated storage location. Another possibility. Finally, you can create a separate document for low impact incident response. That separate document can either be a parallel plan, which is sort of modeled on your existing medium and high impact plan, but is not considered as best cyber system information because it only covers low impact. You can kind of split your plan into, this is the plan and these are the procedural steps. And so the procedural steps are not classified as an incident response plan, don't qualify as best cyber system information, and only contain, the things that apply specifically to those initial responders within the low impact facility, or only cover those who are called upon to, provide localized support for investigation being carried out somewhere else. So there are multiple ways to get around this, but it is something that you need to be aware of as you're constructing this plan so that you end up with a good feel for how to avoid these SIP 11 headaches and don't fall into a trap where you've set yourself up to fail elsewhere in the program in the course of handling the low impact materials. Okay. All right, so let's move on to physical access control. Physical access control is very broadly written within the standard. There are no explicit requirements for any given level of access control. So in theory, you can write a plan which says our method of controlling access is to maintain adequate fencing around the facility and ensure that there is some form of lock on the gate into the facility. And if you can make a good faith argument to an auditor that this constitutes controlling physical access to the best cyber systems within the facility, then go implement that and you have achieved compliance. We'll see, we're quite a ways from the first low impact audit, so how thorough the auditors are going to be in applying a smell test to claimed controls for physical access, well, that's a good question. It's one of those, yes, there are those in the regulatory community who would much prefer to have tighter specified controls. Whether they try to backdoor some of those in is an unknown at this time. But, as far as what's actually literally in the standard, the only guidance that you have is that you're required to physically control access. Now, whatever you decide constitutes physically controlling access, it's going to have to be documented. You have to create that plan from SIP 3R2, and you have to have it signed off on, and it has to be approved, which means that there is no more plausible deniability. There's no, well, we thought we had better controls in place than that, nothing else. This is the plan, and we've approved it, so therefore we feel that this properly manages the risk of getting in there. That's going to mean that your rusty fence with an old padlock on it and no key control in place solution is going to be a little bit harder to live with, because it's going to mean that somebody far enough up the food chain to sign this document has to approve it. All organizations are going to have to settle for this and have to wrestle with this on their own, kind of determine what the level of controls is that they really require and what the level of controls are that properly meets their definition of controlling that physical access. And it may be tricky if you've had an internal push to try and improve security. It may be tricky to try and approve a lower level simply because you've kind of already defined that properly controlling access, calls for the higher level that you've discussed internally. You're going to have to work this out. One thing that, because this is largely a documentation project in the sense that your plan has to exist, has to be approved, has to be implemented, the more commonality you can get in your controls, the better off you are. If you have the aforementioned 200 substations and every single one of them has to have a separate physical security plan, then that's going to be a bit of a documentation headache. It's managed, it's doable, but you're going to spend a lot of time just managing that rather than actually doing things that you care about doing. So with that in mind, the more controls you can get in common are great. And in a perfect compliance world, and this does not reflect the perfect physical world, but in a perfect compliance world, you would have one common physical security plan across the enterprise, possibly with variations for different classes of substations or whatever. But for the most part, you want to have a common plan in the center, and then document any local variations to it within a given facility. There may be a short template or something that each facility fills out, but you get everything in place where you've got a common plan across the way. What you have to decide in the end is whether it's more work to implement and maintain common controls, or whether it's more work to implement separate documents for each facility forever. And that's something that each organization will have to kind of work through on their own. Okay. Final area to look at, electronic access control. If low-impact external routable connectivity is allowed, it must be protected by a low-impact external access point. We're not going to get into the definition of lurk just yet, because we're going to talk about it some more, because that ball has not stopped bouncing yet. But a low-impact external access point, a LEAP, is going to be part of the requirements no matter where the ball stops bouncing after the next drafting team gets through. So this means some method of controlling access into the facility where any external and routable traffic must pass through it and be controlled. Typically speaking, this is going to be a firewall. That's the state of the art, and that's kind of where most things are. So, this is going to be a call essentially for any facility, substation, or generating plant which has external routable connectivity to have a firewall in place. And hopefully you have something like a common architecture, and hopefully you have some way to either these are already implemented and you can document it and move on, or you have a plan for doing so, or an easy method to do so. But that's going to be the overall scope of this. So this is one that commonality across the industry is spread. So a lot of locations already have firewalls in every place where this is the case. This is especially true for large generating fleets, but tends to be true even for some substation operations, just because it's rare these days to connect a network without a firewall. But there are some out there that have older network infrastructures or whatever that have implemented at least limited network connectivity within the substation framework and not had firewalls in place in the process. So this may be again one of those resource hogs that you want to identify in the course of making your plan. Okay, so those are our 4 overall areas that are approved by FERC at this point and that are definitely going to happen. So what else is possible going out from here? Well, There is a drafting team which has been formed to address outstanding FERC direction and is beginning work now. I believe the first meeting is actually in Atlanta next week. Excuse me, and some of the groundwork is already being laid. Some of those things have nothing to do with low impact whatsoever, and are I would say the bulk of their work actually is focused around things like the pending communication standard, the potentially pending supply chain management standard, those sorts of things. But there are a couple of things that do impact on low impact facilities that are part of their brief as they're moving forward. First of all, that definition of LERC that we kind of glossed over earlier, FERC does not like the existing definition, which involves the words direct connectivity. I'll be honest with you, a lot of the last drafting team wasn't crazy about that definition either. It was kind of a compromise and didn't please everyone. But there is some tightness to this that's kind of needed, because the whole question of if one link in the chain is a serial connection, but you can do routability over it, does that constitute LERC, or in general terms, does that constitute external routable connectivity, since this issue kind of expands beyond low impact? And as you know, if you've been following CIP at all, the industry has been wrestling with how to handle serial connections, well, really since the beginning of the time that there were standards, and various solutions have never quite been pleasing or workable. And so this is the latest attempt to address that. With that in mind, there are some things that are going to constitute LERC. If you have IP connectivity to every device in the substation, or any devices at the substation, but at some point you're going to have LERC, you might as well go ahead and be making plans to put a firewall in if there's not one there. Okay. The other end of the spectrum, if you have you don't have serial connections at all, or if the only connections that you have are serial point-to-point with no interactive connectivity allowed, anytime it communicates data over that into a remote terminal unit, but it doesn't doesn't have any other means of communicating, and the only way to connect to the device is to go to the substation and plug something into a console port, you can be fairly certain you don't have LERC. In between there, you can at least be scoping. You can at least figure out, okay, these are the categories of assets that we have in our low impact fleet, and this is the amount of effort that it's going to take, depending upon how this decision comes out of the drafting team. So overall, you can kind of get a feel for, this is what the potential impact on the schedule is. Make your plan based upon all the possible outcomes from there, and identify possible resources without engaging them at this time. So it's something that you can, at least in the planning process, allow for the uncertainty and have multiple paths in place for how you get to a successful conclusion. Okay. Second piece that the drafting team is tasked with right now is that the controls that are in CIP 10R4 in version 6 for transient cyber assets and removable media, FERC feels that that's important enough and likely enough to occur in a low impact environment that they want to see some controls, whether similar or lessened or whatever, designated for low impact as well. So that's something that the drafting team is going to have to wrestle with and figure out what's appropriate. Just at a wild guess here at the beginning of the process, it's quite likely to look similar to what CIP 10R4 looks like, so that you get to declare your own program with the constraints that that program has to address certain requirements or certain conditions, I guess would be a better term. And I think it will end up looking like that. At this point, this one's foggy enough, and because this is largely a controls-based system, a functional procedural controls-based system, sorry. It's going to be primarily write a procedure, write a document, and so on. It's unlikely to come in before 2018, so it doesn't impact your overall plan a whole lot. You have time to sit back and kind of watch what the drafting team does on this one. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's sum up. You need to get started. As I said, this is a call to action. You don't need to get started driving, putting in windshield time, driving to substations and installing firewalls and fences and whatever. So we're not at that point. But you do need to get some plan for, this is what our likely CIP 3R2 plans are going to look like. These are the commitments that we're likely to make. So it's going to take us this much time to do this in each location. And maybe allow some time for surveying and getting the lay of the land on the front end. And these are the resources we have available, and this is how well it fits into the schedule and when we need to get started overall and what the pressure points are and all those things. So at this point in time, you need to get started making that plan so that you have control of this, and you don't find out 6 months from now that you're already behind and having to scramble to identify resources to catch up, because resources are always plentifully available on the open market right up until the point where you need them, and then at that point it's suddenly a crunch. So you want to make sure that you're not in that same boat with everyone else. With that, I appreciate the time, and we will pass it back over and look for any questions that have come up during the course of time. So thank you for that.